You're listening to Weird and Dead, the paleontology podcast that tells evolution's most embarrassing and bizarre stories. I'm Megan Wetherell.
And I'm Amy Atwater, and we are two living scientists who are weirdly excited about dead things. On this episode, we discuss why dinosaurs are technically giant scrotums. Yeah, you heard it here. At least, they sure looked like that to the first person who named them.
We'll talk all about naming fossils, the rules they're in, and what happens when you break the rules.
Big dead lizards.
We do talk a lot about genitalia and how early paleontologists could not fully recognize it because they clearly never got laid. So check the description for this and other content warnings.
All right, we're going to dive right on in.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I know. I'm still trying to figure out my amazing... Oh, well, when it comes to naming dinosaurs and naming all organisms, it's a little more complicated than being like, this one looks like an Amy. There's a process. We're going to be diving into that process today, and a story to get us started is about naming dinosaurs. And the fact that there is an argument to be made that all dinosaurs around today should actually be called scrotum humanums. And it's a very entertaining story that I will give you a brief overview now. So the first dinosaur bones, that means not birds. We're talking, when you think of a dinosaur, that's the right thing to be thinking of. The first fossil that was discovered, at least by white people who wanted to label it, was the distal end of a femur. And so that's your thigh bone. And it's your, like, the end part of it. So the part closer to your knee, not your hip. Now, this part of the bone, if you haven't seen one, is kind of interesting looking. So it's got two rounded knobs where it meets your tibia to form your knee. And when you see it without the rest of the bone, like if it just is the end of the femur, it kind of looks like a ball sack. And that's exactly what these dudes in Europe thought when they found their first dinosaur bone. It was this lower part of a femur, and it looks like a ball sack. And so it was illustrated in this book that came out from England, where it was discovered in 1763, where they called it scrotum humanum because they were comparing it to the appearance of giant human testicles. And we're going to talk about naming and why names are the way that they are. But essentially, there's some arguments that could be made that since it was named this first, all dinosaurs should be called this. Now, some people argue that, well, it was just like a label it's an illustration, and we will include the illustration because it is very funny. And they're like, oh, it's just it's just like a caption in this illustration. They didn't mean for it to actually be a scientific name. However, folks have pointed out that, and as we are going to talk about, the scrotum humanum definitely follows the kind of Linnaean system of the binomial kind of name with like a genus and a species. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, no, it was meant to be a scientific name. Like, this is what the first dinosaur was called. Now, we don't go around calling dinosaurs scrotum humanum, which is a pity, and we should bring it back.
A tragedy, an absolute tragedy.
Because I think Scrotum Park would be so much more entertaining than, and yeah, I mean, but scrotum humanum, I kind of went over a little bit about what we're going to dive into, but why don't we use scrotum humanum? Where does this Linnaean system come from? Like, what goes into naming an organism? That's the topic for today.
Yeah, so I guess kind of the first thing that we really have to talk about is, how do you name a species? What actually goes into it? And both Amy and I have had the dubious pleasure of having to do this. Once you've done it once, you realize it's not as fun, actually, as people make it out to be. So we thought we'd walk you through a little bit of that process first. So the first thing that you have to do is demonstrate that it's different, that it's not other species that look like it, which, when you find a giant ballsack bone, is perhaps a little easier. I don't think any of those early paleontologists were like, well, how can you prove that that's not my ballsack? So
that's different, man.
Initially a significantly easier task, but over time it has become more complicated because we know more about the fossil record. So it's easier to be like, well, are you sure that it's not this pre-existing species, right?
And what's really funny about this time period too with Scrotum humanum is that this is before we even acknowledge that things went extinct. So these folks named it Scrotum humanum fully thinking there was a thing out there, a living thing out there still alive that just had this giant ball sack. So I love to think about the context of that too. It's beautiful.
I love to think about the idea that, like they probably thought of it in a biblical context. There's some fighting of a giant that goes on in one of those, right?
Yes, I think so.
And that all that was left from that dead giant was its testicles.
It's the only thing that preserved. It's the most important part.
Clearly the hardest part of the body, definitely not the most sensitive and tender and mushy. So giant ball sack. All right, so once you've established no human has that size of ball sack, so it must come from something else, then you have to publish. You can't just say, I found a set of giant rock testicles. You have to publish it. And when you publish it, it becomes something called a holotype. So a holotype is the first published example that anybody else who finds a giant or medium-sized set of rock testicles has to cross-compare those to the original testicles, the original Scrotum humanum, to say, okay, well, these testicles / dinosaur knee are different sizes. So a holotype is really, really important because the holotype is what everybody else uses to cross-compare. That said, holotypes are often garbage.
Yes.
There are so many Oreodont holotypes that are just like one isolated tooth. There's a holotype that's a foot that just turned out to be the foot of a species that we already knew about. It's just They only found the foot in that case.
Right. Feet are bad. Don't use feet for...
Yeah, don't use feet. Feet and ball sacks. That's this episode, apparently.
Just don't.
But the burden of evidence over time has become greater and greater as we've become better and better about recognizing differences. So these days, it would be pretty hard, especially with Oreodonts, to, say that there's a new species with just a single tooth. You would probably need a fair amount more research to go into that.
Well. Obviously, you don't work with human evolution where everyone is like, I found a partial molar. It's a new genus. And we're not going to go... In this episode, we're definitely touching on what the heck a species is and what a genus is and, all these different... We're not going to do a deep dive on that today because we could, record 10 podcasts, individual shows on the topics of what species are and how you determine what is. So it's very funny how different groups of animals, so Megan's been talking about Oreodonts, which are extinct hooved creatures, sheep, pig, camel mammals, but certain groups of animals, especially if they're really quote unquote popular, they tend to have different rules. It's kind of interesting. So that's just my own sassy background, because a lot of dinosaurs, you don't need to have nearly the material and human evolution. You can have very sparse fossil material to be it's a whole new species, and it kind of drives me crazy.
Regardless, that's what a holotype is. There's also other types of types. So there's things like a paratype. A paratype is if you find one really good fossil that really demonstrates all of the cool features of the animal that you're talking about and shows how it's different. But then there's this second, super cool chunk that has a chunk of the jaw or whatever. You could call that a paratype. And it's basically just another fancy way of saying, if you want to know if your species is like my species, you should probably come look at these specific fossils. There's also things like co-types, which are really big from in the 1940s. Co-types are, I found 2 precious, amazing fossils that are virtually identical. I can't choose between them. So I choose both of them.
Such problems.
Sort of like a Hunger Games-esque decision process. And that is a little bit frowned upon now. People don't really love it if you can't decide on one to be the holotype. But regardless, there's a lot of different types of types out there. especially if you're trying to rename something. So once you've got your precious specimen, which is hopefully more than a tooth, hopefully more than just the bottom section of a femur that looks like a ball sack, you then have to decide upon the name that you're going to give to your beautiful, lovely creature. And there are rules now for those names. And those rules are administered by this place called, for animals, it's called the ICZN.
It's a mouthful.
International Committee of Zoological Nomenclatures, something like that. So this place has come up with some rules. And I will say that as we were researching this episode, I realized that a lot of the things that I have heard are rules about naming animals are not rules. They are suggestions. And it is also worth pointing out that the ICZN considers themselves arbitrators and not the cops. There's not like this weird naming police force that's going to go after you if you name it wrong. There are specific rules. First off, it has to be novel. We'll get into what happens sometimes when it's not. So it needs to be a new genus, a new species name. That set of those two have to be new. And it is specific that it's a set. So there's like hundreds of species that were named after marsh. So there's like a lot of marshae as species, but they all have a different genus name. So technically they're considered different. So you have to have the two words, the genus and the species. Please stop doing that.
But come up with something. Just choose something else, guys. We know what, like they had their moment. Let's recognize some other people, or like maybe not even people, maybe.
Yeah, maybe other characteristics. So there have to be the two words and they have to be novel when used in combination. That said, there are multiple instances where an animal has the same name as a plant. And because those are two separate kingdoms, that is actually considered okay. So there's a ficus that's a plant and there's a ficus that's a beetle. And from reading through the frequently asked questions on the ICZN, they're basically like, no one's going to talk about beetles and plants in the same thing. It's fine. So as long as they're in different kingdoms, so Animalia versus plants, whatever, then it's still okay. So some other rules, so it has to be binomial, has to have two. It has to use Latin letters, meaning the 26 letters of the Latin alphabet. You can't have things like umlauts. You can't have like accents on words. You can't even have things like underscores in the name. I guess those are used in some languages to indicate certain like pronunciation things. It has to be in the Latin letter system. That said, it does not need to be Latin. And one big myth out there is that it has to be something known as a dead language. So Latin is, I think, technically considered a dead language because we don't have full conversations in Latin. If you're a scientist, you're going to learn a little bit of Latin, not a lot, and definitely not correct pronunciation.
No, never.
But you will learn a little bit of Latin, but nobody speaks it. There is no rule that it has to be a dead language. It can be in any language. It's nice if the species name and the genus name are in the same grouping. So when I named an Oreodonts, the genus name was already Diplobunops, which is Greek. So I chose Cardula, which is also Greek, as the species name. I also chose Cardula because it really technically means sweetheart. It's like a term of endearment, but nobody on the editorial team asked me about that. So I gave a nice little nickname to an Oreodon. So it's nice if they match, but they don't necessarily have to. And it is really important that we move away from this myth of dead languages, because a lot of the languages, especially in America, that we've started to apply to fossils are not dead languages. They are Native American languages. And those are not dead. There are still people speaking them, regardless of what our ancestors tried to do to them.
Yeah, it's an interesting. Yeah, I have many feels on the subject. Yeah. Yes, as someone who has also named a couple primates, not humans. Again, God, no, people ruined human evolution. Okay, go study the cute ones. There's like way less competition and they're way more fun. And there's way more material, which is really nice too. But yeah, I named 3 new genera and 3 new species for my masters. And one of the names that we came up with is Equiamachius, Walshi. So right there where I think we're already kind of not playing by the rules because we're mixing.
It's not a rule. It's a suggestion.
A recommendation. Yeah. Right. Thank you. Thank you. And that is, I think it means the place behind the clouds. And it is of the indigenous people who lived in San Diego, and I'm sure still do. And so these fossils are from San Diego. It's from the Eocene though. So, like 43 million years ago, these ones are. And it's from the Cuyama tribe. And I'm probably not saying Equiamachus correctly. I'm probably not saying the tribe name correctly. One of the most famous primate fossils that we have in North America is this really weird primate called Egimoishashala, which shows up after most other primates have all gone extinct in North America. Like they go extinct by the end of the Eocene, and then this guy pops up in South Dakota and Oregon in the Oligocene. Yeah, Egimoishashala, which is a Sioux word, and I believe it's translated to like little cat face man, because when they saw the primate skull, which is fitting, primates and cats both have forward-facing eyes, and so that's the name of that one. And I know I'm not pronouncing it correctly either, as I don't know the language. And it's a really, I think, there are obviously perspectives on these topics that are all valid. I think it's a great way to acknowledge other aspects of these fossils and the history of this land. Ideally, though, what I did not do, and I'm calling myself out for, my co-author and I did not connect with anyone from the tribes of San Diego to actually talk to them about this. And I look back on that and wish that we had put a little bit more work into that. And I have heard of situations in Oregon where some colleagues have been able to work with tribes to be able to agree upon and come up with a name together about these fossils that are from their ancestral homelands. So I think it's a great step in the right direction. I do think that we could be better at it, myself included. And then ironically, all of the other names from my paper were for dead white guys. So I don't know if I really neutral out with that. I don't know. Did I break even? I don't know how that will be determined. I don't know why I'm saying that like I believe in Judgment Day, but maybe I do.
Paleontological naming karma. So specific.
I know, but it's very interesting. So it's just interesting food for thought. Like if you are in the position, it is exciting and fun to name something, but then it's not after you dig into it at all. And there are ways to, people have very different philosophies on it, whether you want to honor those who came before you, whether you want to name it after your dog, whether you want to name it after pop culture. We're going to get into some examples of that too. And I wanted to ask Megan, so one of the rules that I have been told that I'm now going, I wonder if this is a rule or not.
I think I know which one you're talking about.
Is that you can't name it after yourself.
And that is not a rule in the ICCN.
Oh my God!
I know, we could have been naming things after ourselves the whole time.
Been robbed.
One piece that is missing in between the ICCN and the people who are actually making up these names is that there is a difference between a rule in the ICCN and a rule that the peer reviewers will smack you with and that the editors will smack you with. So,
okay. A
lot of times when someone says, I wasn't able to get a name past review, they don't mean that the ICCN was like, that's incorrect, because it probably was fine. It's that the editor was like, you cannot name this after yourself, or you cannot name this after Wolverine from the Wolverine comics. There's decision making that goes into names that is beyond the ICCN, that is not strictly forbidden, but is really kind of up to the discretion of the editor.
Interesting. So this whole time,
no editor would let you name it after yourself, but the ICCN would let you name it. They say specifically that it's, I think on their frequently asked questions, they said it's okay. It's just not very humble of you. So
I was going to say, it seems like the editors are kind of stepping in as narcissist police.
Yeah.
And I'm like, step aside. Let me have my moment. Because as we are also talking about, there are so many, there's a handful of people who've had hundreds of things named after them.
Yeah.
And I also, here's my other sad story. It's not a sad story. Listen to me. Name something after me. But for my master's, I decided to name one of my species after the collections manager at the San Diego Natural History Museum who had been a huge help in the whole process. And one of the reasons I did it too was because I was a collections manager at this point, and I was low-key hoping that then someone I help will name something after me, which has not happened yet. So screw you guys that I assisted at my last museum as a collections manager. Because of course, like, it'd be really, really cool. And I am so tired of seeing one particular dinosaur guy's name as like species names all over the place. Yeah. I'm just like, oh my God, you've had so many things named after you. You're also, never mind. But, I just, come on, guys, share the love. And also maybe we should let underrepresented groups and women name things after themselves just so we can get a freaking leg up on this total unbalanced, like, naming system that we've got going on. Because it's right. It's like Marsh and Cope. And it's just like, oh my God, get over it.
Marsh and Cope. And whoever Thompson I is, fucking everything is named after Thompson I. There's 1,000 Thompson I's.
Yeah. And then, there's all these like Leedies, and it's like, no, okay, all right, okay, no. So anyway, those are my thoughts. But okay, so we've talked about the ICZN for animals and all that. They're not cops. So like, how is this actually patrolled?
Sure. Yeah.
How do we actually evaluate this?
Because the ICZN is not the name police, it is really up to you, your peer reviewers, and your editors to come up with a name that follows their rules. This is especially important because a lot of times editors will only enter names into ZooBank, which is run by the ICZN, after something is already published. So sometimes they'll try to enter something in ZooBank and it's going to be flagged because it's not technically a new name.
Okay.
It's not novel. But the ICZN isn't going to do anything to you. If you fuck up a name, it just leaves an opening for other people to rename your species.
Shady. Sabotage.
Amazing paleontological gossip for all future generations when they go back through the notes and realize how sassy everyone is.
Oh my gosh.
Perfect. I love reading papers like that.
They're fantastic.
But more drama, please.
I love academic speak version of drama too. Like, I knew that I was sufficient at reading scientific papers when I realized I was picking up on sass between authors. I was like, oh, I'm actually getting good at this now. I can tell that they're being a huge dick. Well, I think we're going to talk about an example of this that is pretty fantastic, but we're going to take a little quick break first and save our files and then be right back.
Then you get to hear about some of the best examples of getting to rename poorly named organisms.
Hey, you know what's not a dinosaur? Everything on this shirt that Megan made for her clothing store, geopedalfabric.com. You can proudly sport your knowledge wearing the Dinosaurus shirt and spread the good word. Enter code WEIRDANDDEAD at checkout for 10% off your order.
Enjoying this episode? Help us make more of them by supporting us on Patreon. For just the cost of a fake trilobite fossil per month, you can also enjoy tons of bonus content. Outtakes, clips we couldn't fit in the show, and of course, you can suggest episodes for us to film next.
So before we left, we were talking about what happens when there is essentially conflict within the names, these scientific names that we ascribe to organisms. Like, what happens when a name is already taken, but we don't know about it. And it is very interesting to me that the ICZN is not like, oh, and then we go back to the original author and give them a chance to correct it. It's like, no, if you mess up, the person who catches your mess up is the person who gets to rename your organism. And I think that's beautiful. I think that's so absolutely sassy. And so, I think there's some folks out there who are just like super, paying attention to details. And you could probably rename a ton of stuff if you have a good eye, because as we're going to learn, like, man, there are way more beetles out there than anything else. We already talked about them with ficus, and we're going to talk about a lot more beetles because there's just shit tons of beetles in this world.
Very diverse.
One of my favorite examples, it's fairly well known and it's still pretty controversial. I would say that it's still like in flux. Like, this has still not been sorted out fully. But in the late 1960s, there's this paleontologist who was doing work in Zimbabwe and found this, or I don't know if they found it, but they described this theropod dinosaur. So theropod dinosaurs, these are your meat-eating ones. These are the sexy ones. They get all the attention.
Literally, they are sexy because there is erotica written about them.
No, it's true. We didn't write it either, and we're a little jealous.
We're really sad about that. Yeah, we should have thought of that first.
Should have thought of that. I think we could still write it better. And we know that
we could write a more accurate scientific rendition of that set of copulations, but I digress.
Shape of Water style with the friggin' cloaca. Got it. Yes. See, we got cloaca in. We got cloaca into the episode. I knew we could do it. I'm so proud of us. So anyway, back to the 1960s. So this paleontologist, a guy named Rath, he decided to name this Zimbabwe theropod dinosaur Syntarsus rhodesensis. And then in 1989, Tim Rowe, a fairly well-known interesting paleontologist, added a species to Syntarsus, which is this Jurassic specimen from Arizona, and named it Kyantate or something like that, like Syntarsus Kyantate. I'm probably going to call it like Syntarsus Africa and Syntarsus Arizona, because even as someone who has been well steeped in scientific literature for a long time, I still struggle with pronouncing scientific names, which I think is something we should normalize because they are tricky and people use that as a way to gatekeep science. And I don't think that's cool. So I'm being honest that I still struggle to this day with pronouncing scientific names, but I will gatekeep in other ways. All right. So
girl boss, gatekeep, whatever the third one is. Gaslight.
Name a fucking fossil after me. Okay. It's just like, so anyway, so Syntarsus, right? Like pretty cool name. It means like fused ankle or something like that. And they're like, yeah, we got this cool theropod dinosaur. Yeah, it's so cool. But spoiler, 100 years before all that happened, some entomologist had already used that name to describe a beetle from Madagascar. So there is already a Syntarsus, and it's in the same kingdom, as we've already talked about, is one of the actual rules. And that means that Syntarsus the dinosaur is invalid. And the dinosaur people were not the ones to figure this out. In fact, the people who did figure it out was a group of entomologists, so people who study insects. And they wrote the funniest, sassiest scientific paper. We will link to it. It's 2 pages. It's really short. And they got to rename the dinosaur because they were the ones that caught it. So I'm just going to read to you the paragraph from the paper because, again, like, it's so beautifully sassy. And I'm going to, struggle through parts of it. And they're like, okay, so this turn of event requires a new name. And even though the Journal of Syntarsus describes it as a small carnivorous dinosaur, though as good and loyal phylogeneticists, we understand that it really wasn't on the lizard lineage. At the scale of an entomologist, it does look like a big dead lizard. So what may be the first name of a dinosaur ever proposed in an entomology journal, we propose the replacement name of Meganosaurus, which literally translates to big dead lizard.
Wait, Meganosaurus translates to big dead lizard?
Meganosaurus. It's spelled.
That's still, I think you could say that is now technically named after me if you pronounce it correctly. And I'm cool with that.
Well, and I mean, that's fitting. You would also think that they're big dead lizards, which we keep messing up while talking about it and calling them big dumb lizards, which I think is also an excellent name. And I just love how sassy it is. It's like, yes, we recognize that technically it's a small carnivorous dinosaur, but from the perspective of a beetle, it would look like a big dead lizard. So we, as beetle scientists, are going to call it big dead lizard.
So good.
They did this in 2001. And I mean, it's just very interesting too, because then I was just like been reading about this, and there's even some colleagues of mine who I've overlapped with in school and whatnot, who study this group of dinosaurs. And they just get I get a little vibe that they're just a little, I don't know, just sour about it, a little salty about it, and can't quite take the joke. I've actually worked with the scientist who named this, Michael Ivey. study. He's at Montana State University. He's an entomologist. He's a really great guy. And I find it so funny. But again, I don't study these dinosaurs. So now there's like a lot of debate about, now some of them are trying to point out that like phylogenetically, so like using characters to try and figure out where these dinosaurs go on an evolutionary tree, that maybe they don't actually belong to Syntarsis and are actually Coelophysis. But then other folks came out and were like, no, it's not Coelophysis. It's still Meganoceros or whatever the hell, big dead lizard. Anyway, it's just like in flux right now, but it does look like the Africa species will be Meganosaurus. But no, it's just like, it's very contentious still. And again, I think it's because out of all the dinosaurs studied, the theropod dinosaurs are, again, like the sexiest ones, and they definitely get the most attention. And therefore, I think there's a lot of ego involved and a lot of fighting over very small amounts of specimens and all that. So I don't know. I'm like, take the joke, guys.
Yeah, no kidding.
But again, we'll see how it goes. And then it's what makes me laugh even harder is that this isn't the only time that this has happened with beetles and dinosaurs. This is definitely the most entertaining that these entomologists came back with such a sassy name. But it's happened with two sauropods, so two long neck dinosaurs, one from South America and one from China, were both given names that were already taken by beetles, and they were able to figure this error out on their own and rename it themselves into very similar but slightly different names. So it's Augustinia and Protonathosaurus are these sauropods, but it's just like, come on, dinosaur paleontologists. Like, okay, we have the resources, right? Megan has been discussing what sort of tools you can use to evaluate whether or not this name has already been taken. So just Google it, guys. It's probably already taken by a beetle.
Probably.
So just, it's just, and that's okay, but come up with, I get it. Syntarsis, what a cool name, I guess. I don't know. But, it's very entertaining. So, dinosaurs have, there's many ways to name a dinosaur, but some of them are wrong. So deal with it. And so that's like one of the classic examples of them being straight up renamed by other people. But I mean, I think we've got some more of those. And then I think we've also got some just some ridiculous names to go over now too. I'm excited to hear these because you have not shared them with me yet.
No. So do you want to go into my list of extremely ridiculous names? Okay.
Yes, please.
So if you go to zoobank.org, you can enter in any Latin word and see how many names come up. Which means, for example, that if you enter the word, let's start with, so the word for garbage in Latin is quisquilius, or quisquil. So there is a quisquilius, which is a genus of fish that literally just means trash.
Oh my God.
And one of the species names is Quisquilius flavicaudatus, or flavicaudatus, so yellow-tailed trash.
You're garbage.
Most of these are fish. Yeah, so then I was like, poop. What's the word for poop?
Right. Of course. I can't believe you didn't start with that, obviously.
Yeah. First up, I looked up the word poop in Latin, and it's Sturcus. So I looked for Sturcus in Zoobank, and I came up with this amazingly named fish. The genus name seems to just be like related to Athens, Greece, but the species name is pretty great. So it's Atherina Sturcus muscarum, which means poop of flies. And it's another fish.
What?
I don't know why it's named poop of flies, but Sturcus muscarum is multiple species were named that.
What?
I think they were all fish. So there's a lot of fish that are named fly poop fish.
I'm just like, so do fish scientists just secretly hate fish?
I don't know. And so going along with the fact that you technically don't need to use Latin, you can use, because the word poop itself I do not think is Latin. But if you enter the word poop in Zoobank like a grown adult with a PhD, you get so many hits, including A genus of weevil, which is a type of beetle,
Woo!
of Pseudopoopofagus.
Fake poop eater?
Yeah, and they are named that because there is also a genus of weevil called a Poopophagus.
We couldn't name you something original. We just had to call you a pseudo version of that poop eater in the family.
Yep. All right, so then, because I was on a roll, I entered
definitely
the word vagina, but without the A, because that way you get everything that's not just ending in an A. And first off, there's not nearly enough scientific names with the word vagina in them. There should be more. But one that I did find is called Proto-Vaginoceras incognitum.
Oh.
So, first vagina horn, unknown.
Wow.
Yeah, it's their translation of it, because I did Google it. Earlier shield horn.
Right. Oh god.
But the word vagina doesn't mean shield. It does mean vagina or scabbard or sheath. So something you put a sword in. Yeah. So I think at best it could be earlier sheath horn. I suspect that they said, oh, it's ancient. It's also not Greek. I'm pretty sure it's Latin. But I'm pretty sure they were trying to get past the editor censors.
So we have a giant scrotum in this episode and a giant vagina is what you're telling me.
That's right. Technically, I think they should have named it Mega Vaginoceras, not Proto Vaginoceras, but maybe there is already a Mega Vaginoceras that just wasn't entered into Zoobank.
Right.
Yeah, so that's vagina. And then, of course, the fantastic. So we know that a lot of things are named after teddies.
Oh, well, of course.
If you search all of these names, not only do you see all of the lists of names, but you do see the count of how many different names there are. Some of them are technically repeats because it's like a genus name. And then if you have multiple species, the genus name gets counted multiple times. But regardless, vagina has 44 species or genera with that in them. Mam, as in mammillary, as in mammoth, as in titties, that's 48 nomenclatural acts. Mastodon is a little different. We'll get to that one in a second because it also means the same thing.
Okay.
Penis, just the straight up word penis.
Yes.
64.
Oh, goddamn.
Yeah, we do need 5 more actually for all of these. Phallus is also 64. Areola or areole, so nipple, is 68.
So close.
And then mast, as in mastodon, as in titty tooth, has 1,064 entries.
Woo!
And that is on feminism and also early male paleontologists maybe not getting to see that many titties, not really knowing what they look like.
They're like, well, you know what this elephant tooth looks like to me. Wow. I'm just gonna.
All right. And so I have 3 more names for you.
Okay. I can't.
The best one I saw within phallus is microphallus, so tiny penis. Microphallus is a genus of parasites, and this is one of the few cases where I thought it was very funny to name that after people. So there is a species, Microphallus hoffmanni.
Oh my god.
Doesn't seem like a compliment unless that guy's your buddy and it's a good joke. Either way, I approve of it.
It's like those, you know how every Valentine's Day or whatever, they're like, hey, you can like name this cat box at the vet after your ex, or, you know, like you can name this shit scooper at the zoo after your ex. Like, no, guys, step it up a notch. Find something with the genus that means micropenis and then add your ex's name as the species name. And like, and they can't do shit about it. That's beautiful. I'm going to keep that in mind.
Yeah, unless it's invalid, they would have to write a whole extra paper saying that it wasn't actually a new species.
Wow. Why have we not used why have we not used scientific names for this sort of revenge? Ideas. New ideas. Yeah, like now maybe I would name them after some of these dinosaur paleontologists if it came after micropenis.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
2 last ones. You got too excited, and I'm not even done. All right. Flexipinus vittatus. which, according to them, means pliant sexual organ, but it means bent dick, and then levittatus means striped. So striped bent
Striped
dick.
bent dick. Yes, thank
That
you.
is named after the flexible gonopodium of the males in a fish.
Again,
so,
these fish people.
These fish people. And the last one, which is my favorite one, which I was laughing so hard and Logan had to tell me to be quiet, is Dexrapenis avidus. Now, Dexrapenis, Dextra, I think, is from Dexter, meaning right or correct. So correct penis. And avidus means beautiful.
Aww.
Beautifully correct penis. That's how you compliment somebody.
And as you should. As you should.
Dexrapenis avidus. Avida penis. That I don't think is a genus name, and it should be.
Beautiful penis. But also no, okay? You guys get enough attention for your dicks. We don't need to praise your genitalia anymore. As we started this episode with describing how the first things have been named after your balls.
So those are the names that I have. Maybe we, if you have some funny ones, that'd be great. Otherwise, maybe we could wrap it up by just I don't know, mourning the loss of scrotum humanum from time and space.
I know. I think we should bring it back. I think we should make one of our podcast t-shirts just be like the image, because it does. It looks like a ball sack, and then just have it say scrotum humanum. It's just, I think it would make a beautiful tattoo. I think that it would we gotta bring it back. Oh man, but names, guys. What is in a name? Would a dinosaur by any other name be called scrotum humanum? Yes.
So technically, scrotum humanum is not valid because why?
So technically, scrotum humanum is not valid because I guess it was literally a caption to an illustration, and it wasn't going through the systematic paleontology. And I don't know if that's a rule or not to go through the etymology and whatever, all of those different aspects. And then the main reason that they say it wasn't, so they say that they think that it was just an illustrator error. They were like, oh, it wasn't actually the author, it was the illustrator. And then the other people are like, well, no, because it's binomial. It follows because all of this is Carolus Linnaeus's fault, who's the guy who came up with the names, which he changed his name to sound more like a scientific name, which is weird. Get a life.
That actually is very important, and I'll bring that up in a second.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting. So they're saying that no, this author, Brooks, had deliberately used the binomial nomenclature and therefore indicated that this was the type specimen for this new genus. And so then it technically has priority over Megalosaurus because it was published first. But then the main reason that it hasn't been used is because it hasn't been used in subsequent literature. Because the ICZN says that if a name has never been considered valid after 1899, which is over 100 years after this guy said scrotum humanum, it can be made invalid, forgotten name. So that's kind of how they justify it today. But I doubt it, because if we still know that it was called scrotum humanum, obviously there's been a cult following for this.
We will make a cult following.
Maybe we should just name the podcast Scrotum Humanum, bringing it back. Because I do question if it really hasn't been included in subsequent literature, or if that's just because, again, dinosaur paleontologists are super sensitive. Not that there's anything wrong with that, okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, guys, I'm very sensitive. But, it's funny. It's funny. Anyway, tell me about Carl Linnaeus.
Okay, so I'll take us out on this note. So Carl Linnaeus was the person who came up with this binomial classification system. So a genus and a species. And he was also the person who came up with the idea of holotypes, that you have to have a specimen specifically that you're basing your description off of. So my question for you is, if that's supposed to be true for every organism living or in the past, who is the holotype for Homo sapien, aka people?
I have heard this. Mm-hmm. I have heard this, that he could be technically the holotype of Homo sapiens, because I've Googled this. They say that there isn't technically an official holotype for Homo sapiens, but because he was the original describer, or like what you just said, that technically it would be Carl Linnaeus.
Yes, that Carl Linnaeus is probably the holotype for humans. Yep.
Yeah. I don't know how I feel about it. Because there's this other really funny story about how supposedly Edward Cope, one of the annoying, okay, God, Amy, stop it. Filter. Edward Drinker Cope, one of the classic dinosaur paleontologists from the Bone Wars, who has had a shit ton of things.
A really bad person.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying what I fear to say. That he, for a while, there's been some claims that he wanted to be the holotype for humans,
suck my dick,
to the point
bro.
where his body was donated to science. And then Bob Bacher famously wrote that he wrote him up as the holotype specimen, which again he can't technically do because of, again, the timing of all of this. And then there was like these crazy reporters who took Cope's skull in the early 90s on a road trip across North America to all these paleo sites, and there's a bunch of like paleontologists who got to pose with Cope's skull at their dig sites and museums and whatnot, because they were like, he's the holotype of Homo sapiens, and he would have, like, it's just really creepy. But there's some weird articles out there about people touring around with Cope's freaking skull. I don't know. It's a weird thing. There probably shouldn't be a holotype for Homo sapiens because we're terrible and we don't deserve it. But yeah, I think technically, if we want to follow the specific rules, which is what we need to do, it'd be Linnaeus.
But I also realize that technically means, there's no holotype for domestic dogs. There's no holotype for domestic cats. There's no holotype for wolf. There's no holotypes for any animals that we really knew what they were, because they were described with a Linnaean name, but they were already a known quantity. So I think anything that was a known quantity by the time that Carl was describing things and giving us this system pretty much just doesn't have a holotype, and that's okay, including people.
So it would have been Linnaeus's
dog or cat.
It would have been Linnaeus's dog or cat or like parakeet or like,
and then I think you just have to like spiral out there. Like, okay, did Linnaeus have a pet bear? No. But did he have like 6 degrees of freedom from a bear? Yes. Okay, that bear is the holotype.
Okay, which bear is it? We're going to dig it up. We're going to find that bear. I know. This is obviously, I mean, it's very problematic too, as you hinted at too. It's just like describing an entire species from one specimen, and acting as if like variation isn't an inherent part of life, and acting like there is an ideal. So this goes back to some fucked up ideas and philosophies around ideal types, which then leads into some pretty problematic stuff with blatant racism and using biological anthropology to perpetuate that white men are the top of the food chain for all things ever. So there's some inherent issues, and maybe we'll dig into this at other times when we feel like getting really more depressed. But until then, I would much rather laugh about fucking giant testicles and how dinosaurs should really be called giant testicles, because they are stupid, giant, pathetic testicles. Oh my gosh.
All right, I think that's where we will end this episode. Is we believe in the lasting duration and power of scrotum humanum. All dinosaur paleontologists are technically scrotum paleontologists, one way or the other.
Oh my gosh. Oh, thanks for joining us.
All right, thank you for joining us.
We're out. Thank you for listening. If you liked the podcast, be sure to rate and review us on your listening platform of choice. We really, really, really appreciate it.
If you'd like to hear more and support the show, you can follow us on Patreon for some exclusive bits, or on our various social media platforms. You can follow Amy on Instagram at Mary Anning's Revenge,
and Megan on Instagram and TikTok as GeoPedalFabric, or both of us at Weird and Dead on Instagram and TikTok. This podcast is brought to you by the Geology Podcasting Network. Network, produced by the traveling geologist, aka Chris Spencer. Our theme song is Unlock Me by Prazkanal.
You can follow them on Spotify, Prazkanal.
Cover art was provided by Chris Spencer and the hosts.
Editing services were provided by Abby Jansen and Chris Spencer, and a little bit of us as well. And this has been hosted and researched by us, Amy Atwater and Megan Weatherall. Thank you for listening.
Again, God, no. People ruined human evolution, okay?